Think your older Apache setup is safe? Think again. The latest security sweep just uncovered 11 different vulnerabilities that affect nearly every version of Apache leading up to 2.466. We're talking about everything from privilege escalation in mod_rewrite to unauthenticated crashes in mod_auth and socache. Today, we're breaking down the Apache 2.4.67 emergency update and why your .htxs files might be leaking your most sensitive data.
Look, I want to be clear right out of the gate. This isn't just some routine, minor patch you can push off until next month. For business leaders, and especially those of you overseeing shared hosting environments, this requires your immediate attention. We're going to translate these deeply technical flaws into the real-world operational impacts you need to understand so you can properly gauge your exposure and, more importantly, protect your clients. Okay, let's just quickly run through our roadmap for this explainer. We'll be covering the Apache security emergency, the remote takeover threat, the shared hosting nightmare, the business impact, and we'll wrap up with your urgent action plan.
Starting with Section 1, the Apache security emergency.
To really understand the gravity of this situation, we first need to look at the sheer scale of the footprint we're dealing with here. Apache powers roughly 23.7% of all websites globally, based on May 2026 data. So, when an emergency patch affects almost a quarter of the active internet, your window to secure your systems before attackers start mass scanning, it's incredibly short. It's literally an industry-wide race against the clock. And let's be honest, an emergency drop-everything-you're-doing patch is the absolute bane of every sysadmin's existence, but with a footprint this massive, you simply cannot afford to delay.
What makes this release a true nightmare scenario is the incredibly rare combination we're seeing. We have a network-exploitable remote takeover bug and an internal shared hosting flaw landing at the exact same time. Now, while 11 vulnerabilities are addressed in total, these top two are what make this an absolute priority. I mean, either one of these vulnerabilities on its own would be enough to trigger an emergency response, but together, they demand a coordinated, immediate sprint from your technical teams.
Moving on to Section 2, the remote takeover threat.
Let's unpack the external danger first, because this poses a critical risk to your entire infrastructure. This specific flaw, CVE-2026-23918, sits right in the HTTP/2 protocol handler for version 2.4.66. It basically acts as a wide-open door for unauthorized external attackers, carrying a severe CVSS score of 8.8. And here's what makes it so incredibly dangerous for business operations. It's reachable over the network and requires absolutely zero user interaction to execute. None. So, how does this actually play out? Well, the attack chain is surprisingly straightforward. A crafted network request comes in and deliberately confuses the server's memory. First, the attacker sends what's called an early stream reset frame. Then, the server's memory management logic gets tripped up and attempts to free the exact same memory region twice, which is a classic condition known as a double free. This corrupts the heap. And that heap corruption potentially allows an attacker to run their own code and take full control of your machine, again, without anyone clicking a link or doing anything. Best case scenario, this crashes your server. Worst case, a total remote takeover.
Let's pivot to Section 3, the shared hosting nightmare. Now we're turning our attention from the outside in, looking at a threat that essentially turns every single customer on a shared server into a potential insider threat. But before we get into the exploit itself, we really need to level set on shared hosting isolation. Because, this is the absolute bedrock of trust for managed hosting providers. When you have hundreds, maybe thousands of customers packed onto the same physical machine, they absolutely must be strictly partitioned. They shouldn't be able to peek at each other's data. That hard, non-negotiable boundary of isolation is exactly the product you're selling.
And the crucial and honestly scary point here is that this supposedly moderate-rated flaw entirely shatters that isolation boundary. And it does it using something as mundane and universally standard as an htaccess file. Think about it. In a shared hosting environment, write access to an htaccess file is practically a given. Every single customer has it so they can manage their own URL redirects and basic settings. This flaw, CV2026-4072, hides right in how the mod_rewrite module evaluates expressions when it processes those everyday files.
Imagine your shared server is an apartment building. In a normal secure world, tenants only have keys to their own locked apartments, right? But this vulnerability effectively hands any tenant a master key.
By just crafting a malicious htaccess file, a user can basically wander right out of their apartment, stroll into their neighbor's apartments, and read their private application credentials, config files, or sensitive adjacent directories. They do all of this using the elevated privileges of the web server process itself. So if you're a provider, your exposure here is directly, mathematically tied to the number of accounts sitting on your unpatched server.
Which brings us nicely to Section 4, Business Impact and Risks.
With the technical mechanics out of the way, let's talk about what this means for executive business risk. Let's compare these twin threats directly. On one hand, you have an external attacker trying to completely compromise the server via that HTTP/2 flaw. That's a critical risk, a full takeover. On the other hand, you have your own internal customers potentially snooping on thousands of adjacent accounts. And here's the kicker. Unlike that first threat, the privilege escalation vulnerability doesn't require some sophisticated, shadowy hacker. It literally just requires a user who already holds a basic $5 hosting account on the affected server.
If either of these vulnerabilities gets actively exploited in your environment, your business is looking at immediate, cascading operational fallouts. We're talking about large-scale data breaches where one customer can just effortlessly read another's database passwords. That instantly snowballs into severe regulatory and compliance violations. And ultimately, this leads to a catastrophic loss of customer trust and reputational damage that, frankly, a hosting provider might never recover from.
Finally, Section 5, your urgent action plan. We've identified the problem, and we know the stakes are incredibly high. Now, as of early May 2026, no confirmed exploitation has been seen in the wild, but you and I both know proof of concept code surfaces fast. So, here is your direct mandate for your IT teams. Step 1. Upgrade to Apache 2.4.67. It's the only complete fix. But if you're delayed for some reason, Step 2 is a vital temporary mitigation. Disable HTTP/2 right now. That will block the worst of the external remote code execution attacks. Step 3. Audit those htaccess write permissions to tighten up shared hosting boundaries wherever you possibly can. And Step 4. Strip out unused legacy modules. For example, mod_dav_lock has its own crash vulnerability in this patch, and let's be real, most modern setups don't even use it anymore.
So I want to leave you with this one critical thought to bring to your technical directors today. How resilient is your true isolation, and what hidden legacy risks are just waiting in your server stack right now? When a mundane, standard feature like an HXS file can completely shatter your entire security model, it is absolutely time to evaluate your real exposure. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Stay safe out there, and seriously, get those servers patched.